Welcome to what's going to be a short lecture on Woodrow Wilson. Today, I'm really going to talk about everything related to Wilson before the United States' entrance into World War I. Obviously, as Wilson is the president who's most associated with the First World War because he was president for the entire duration of it, that tends to dominate his presidency. As a consequence, we will be talking about today some of the other smaller issues related to what he was able to accomplish. And by and large, we're talking about a couple of things. The first is what I want to specify as New Freedom. New Freedom was Wilson's logo. It was his slogan for what he saw as a series of progressive style reforms designed to benefit the common man. These were economic and social reforms. They included things like tariff reform. The Underwood Simmons Act of 1913 lowered tariff rates really for the first time in decades, aiming to reduce the cost of goods for consumers. Then there was the Federal Reserve Act. For the first time, under Wilson, the United States established a Federal Reserve System. This was in 1913, creating a national banking system to regulate the money supply and stabilize the economy. It did a lot. Unfortunately, as we'll find out in 1929, it didn't do enough to prevent the Great Depression. Wilson also instituted the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC. This was created in 1914 to prevent unfair business practices and allow the government to regulate business and promote competition. One of the things you should take away from this is that throughout the progressive era, you can start to see the United States government getting bigger. And this is important because really, we associate it with the enlargement of the government with FDR and his New Deal. But the reality is, you can already see the United States being more willing to accept larger governments in the progressive era. And that's only going to continue as we go forward. Finally, they were able to pass what was called the Clayton Antitrust Act. This was passed in 1914. It strengthened antitrust laws and protected labor unions. The next thing we want to address are the different constitutional amendments that were passed in Wilson's presidency. We usually call these the progressive amendments. There were a few. The first was the 17th Amendment. This was ratified in 1913 and allowed for the direct election of senators by the people of each state. Prior to 1913, state legislators were allowed to choose their senators, so they weren't actually elected by the people. Progressives were very interested in expanding direct democracy. You may recall the founding fathers were hesitant when it came to direct democracy. They preferred indirect democracy, where the people would have a say, but that say would be constrained. But the progressives saw it differently. They wanted common people to have more of a say in their government. And the 17th Amendment did that. It gave people the right to elect their senators for the first time. The other two amendments were actually ratified very, very late in Wilson's term, one as he was actually leaving office. The 18th Amendment was ratified in 1919. It established prohibition, which banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. As we will discuss when we get to the Roaring Twenties, the 18th Amendment was an abysmal failure and perhaps increased, not decreased, the amount of alcohol consumption by the United States, and certainly increased the role of organized crime. Lastly, there's the 19th Amendment. This actually doesn't get ratified until Wilson is out of office in 1920, but it was something he was a major proponent of. The 19th Amendment finally gave women the right to vote. This is what's referred to as the Women's Suffrage Amendment. Women had been agitating for this ever since the Revolutionary War came to an end. And finally, in 1920, they got it. There were a few other notable events that's worth talking about other than World War I if we think about Woodrow Wilson. The first is the Panama Canal opens in 1914, which significantly reduces travel time for ships between the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. During Wilson's turn, the Mexican Revolution breaks out and really hits a fever pitch. It starts in 1910, but it's roaring by the time Wilson comes into play. His administration had to navigate the complexities of what was a very, very complicated revolution, seeking to protect American interests while always promoting democracy in Mexico. The last is the reason that Woodrow Wilson is not considered a better president, and that's racism and racial segregation. Unfortunately, if judged through the lens of the modern world, we would have to say that Woodrow Wilson qualified as at least a bigot, if not an outright racist. His presidency saw increased racial segregation in the federal government offices and departments. He was a big proponent of racist films and movies, particularly the one that you see pictured there, Birth of a Nation, which he hailed as the greatest movie of all time. It is the blackest mark on Wilson throughout the ages and has seen a major reduction in his support, particularly in the last half decade. That ends today's lecture. Those are the most important events that you need to know about Woodrow Wilson, other than World War I. Next time, we'll dig into Wilson and his entry into what was then called the Great War.